If you live long enough, you learn the hard truth. Not every marriage is built on love. Not every relationship is built on respect, and money alone never guarantees happiness. My daughter-in-law came from wealth, and she measures everyone through the cold lens of cash, ready to humiliate me with every cruel trick she can imagine, assuming I'm a frail, penniless old woman she can trample. She made a terrible mistake. I'm not the easy target she thought I was, and today I'll show you exactly how I taught her and her whole family what happens when you pick on the wrong person. Join me in this video to watch justice served. Tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share if you want more stories of truth and payback. When I opened my eyes, the world was white and cold. The faint hum of the hospital machines mixed with the sharp scent of disinfectant. I leaned my head back against the pillow, each breath shallow but steady. Outside, snow fell in thin, floating lines, painting the glass window with quiet sorrow. For a moment, I thought I was alone. Then the door opened with a soft click, and in came Hannah Matthews, my daughter-in-law, with her parents trailing behind her. Scarlett was wrapped in fur despite the heated room, and Jonathan carried himself like a man stepping into a business meeting rather than a hospital room. A few relatives followed their coats, expensive, their smiles thin and rehearsed. I tried to sit up straighter, but Hannah's voice cut through the sterile air. "Poor thing, at least you got a nice room," she said lightly, glancing around as if inspecting the furniture. "After all, it's good. Your son married well." The others chuckled, nodding in agreement, as though my illness were a footnote to their comfort. I forced a faint smile, the kind one wears when politeness is the only weapon left. Their words slid across the room like frost, pretty but cold. Not one of them asked how I felt or whether I had eaten. Scarlett placed a bouquet of lilies on the nightstand, their perfume too strong for the small space, and said that hospitals always made her queasy. Jonathan muttered something about the parking fee. I looked at their polished shoes, the snow melting into small puddles on the floor, and felt a strange calm. Years of family dinners of quiet humiliation behind fine china had taught me how to stay silent, while others paraded their pity. Outside the window, the snow thickened, and for the first time, I realized how bright the world could look when everything fake was stripped away. Scarlett's voice sliced through the quiet room, bright and polished, like a talk show host pretending to care. "See, Jonathan, the old lady is actually quite sweet, just unfortunate." Her tone was syrupy, her smile stretched too wide. Jonathan let out a fake sigh and tapped his watch, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "If it weren't for my daughter, this woman would probably be in some public hospital by now, huh?" The group laughed politely, a ripple of amusement spreading across the room. I lowered my eyes, letting the laughter fade above me like static. My hands rested on the blanket, thin and trembling, but inside, I felt a calm, sharper than glass. One of the younger relatives, a girl with bright red nails and a perfect blowout, lifted her phone. She angled the camera toward me, pretending to adjust the lighting. "Say hi, Mrs. Sullivan. We're sending love to our followers." Her voice was too cheerful, the kind reserved for charity videos. The flash went off, capturing me mid-blink, pale and exhausted. Within seconds, she was already typing a caption. "Visiting my daughter's mother-in-law, so sweet and humble." I watched her thumbs fly, her smile satisfied, as if kindness could be measured in likes. Scarlett leaned closer to Jonathan, whispering something that made him smirk. They stood there like actors in a play they had rehearsed too many times. I wondered if they ever saw how transparent they were. My room was not a gift from their daughter. The private nurse, the specialized treatment, the quiet corner room with a view of the snow, all paid from my own account. Years of careful saving and discreet investments had built a portfolio large enough to cover anything I needed. None of them knew. They saw only a week-old woman lucky to be under their charity. As they chatted, posing for one more photo beside my bed, I stared at the reflection in the window. Snow kept falling soft but endless, and behind their laughter, I heard the faint echo of my own patience hardening into resolve. One day, their words would turn against them. Hannah placed a small box on the side table, her tone dripping with sweetness. "We brought you a little something, Mother, just to show how much my family cares." I gave her a faint smile, unsure whether to thank her or brace myself. Jonathan crossed his arms and nodded with a smirk. "Yes, you should be grateful. Not everyone gets this kind of attention from their in-laws." His laughter was short, dry, like a cough that came from pride more than humor. The others leaned forward, curious, their eyes gleaming the way people look at a show they've paid for. I reached for the box, my fingers trembling slightly. The ribbon was gold, but the paper had wrinkles as if it had been reused. Inside were 3 packs of instant noodles, 2 cans of cheap soup, and a plastic bottle of vitamins marked with a bright red clearance sticker. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. Then the laughter, polite, hesitant, cruel, broke the silence. My breath caught in my throat. Hannah tilted her head, smiling gently, as if delivering medical advice. "These are good for elderly people with limited means," she said slowly, her voice clear enough for everyone to hear. "Help save money on those pricey prescriptions. Take care of your health." Her words hung in the air, polished and venomous. I could see Scarlett suppressing a laugh, Jonathan pretending to check his phone, and one of the cousins looking away, embarrassed, yet amused. The sound of the heart monitor pulsed softly beside me, each beep reminding me that I was still here, still alive to feel the sting of their kindness. I looked at the soup cans glinting under the hospital light, labels bright and cheerful, and realized how easy it was for generosity to become humiliation in the hands of the cruel. I folded the lid back down, my movements calm, deliberate. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady, though my chest burned. "You always know what's practical." No one spoke after that. The silence was almost respectful, or maybe afraid. Outside, snow kept falling soft and endless, covering everything that once seemed clean. I held the box with trembling hands and let my voice quiver just enough to sound fragile. "Thank you," I whispered, kindness, like this is worth more than gold. A chorus of satisfied smiles spread across the room. Hannah reached for her mother's hand, as if she had just done something saintly. Jonathan nodded in approval, clearly convinced of my gratitude. I lowered my eyes, careful not to reveal the flicker of amusement that almost reached my lips. In the reflection of the wall mirror, I caught each of their faces, their smirks, their glances, the little gestures of superiority they thought I was too weak to notice. Every expression was a piece of evidence, and I was already collecting them like cards on a table. They saw an old woman with shaking hands and failing strength. They didn't see the years I had spent studying market trends, watching numbers rise and fall, learning patience the way others learned prayer. Behind the calm of my eyes was a woman who once worked 3 jobs and still managed to invest every spare dollar. 3 properties stood quietly under different management firms, each bringing in rent every month. My stock portfolio, now in 7 figures, was built from decades of discipline, not luck. But none of that was for their ears. They needed to believe the illusion because pity made people careless, and careless people made mistakes. I shifted slightly on the bed, pretending to struggle with the blanket. Scarlett hurried to adjust it clearly, enjoying her role as the charitable matron. Her perfume filled the air, sharp and artificial. I murmured another thank you, soft and vague, watching their confidence deepen. They were so sure of their power that none of them noticed the bouquet beside my bed, white lilies with a small silver button at the base. My grandnephew had placed it there days ago, a nanny cam, he said, to make sure the nurses treated me well. None of them realized it was recording every word, every smirk, every cruel little laugh. Outside, the snow fell thicker, muting the world in white. I looked out at it for a long moment, letting my reflection blur in the window. The first move had been made, and they didn't even know they were already on the board. The door opened again with a sudden burst of cold air. I turned my head slowly, thinking it was another nurse, but then I saw him, my son Oliver. He was holding a bouquet of yellow tulips and a small paper bag filled with fruit. His steps froze the moment he saw the room full of Matthew's faces, their laughter echoing too loudly in the sterile air. The brightness in his eyes dimmed. He looked from them to me to the table beside my bed, where the opened gift box still sat. His gaze lingered on the red clearance sticker stuck across the bottle of cheap vitamins. Then he looked at my hands, trembling slightly as they gripped the blanket. Scarlett clapped her hands softly, her tone sugary. "Oh, you came just in time, Oliver. Your mother-in-law just received a lovely gift from us." She smiled wide, pretending to ignore the tension thickening in the air. But Oliver didn't answer. His jaw tightened, and for a second, the silence grew heavier than the snow falling outside. Hannah shifted uncomfortably, brushing imaginary dust off her sleeve. Jonathan looked down, suddenly fascinated by his watch. Oliver's eyes moved between them one last time before he walked to my side. He placed the tulips next to the insulting box, their bright color standing in defiant contrast. I could see his throat move as he swallowed hard, fighting something he didn't want to say. His voice came out low and steady, the kind of tone that carried quiet promises instead of threats. "Mom," he said, "from now on, I won't let anyone treat you this way again." The laughter in the room died. Even Scarlett's perfect smile faltered, and Hannah's lips pressed into a thin line. No one dared speak. Oliver stayed by my bed, his hand resting gently on my shoulder, as if anchoring both of us to the ground. I met his eyes and saw something I hadn't seen in years. Rage mixed with love, the look of a man who had finally woken up. In the corner, the small bouquet of lilies held its silent secret. The hidden camera inside kept rolling, capturing every glance, every flicker of guilt, every trace of my son's fury. I smiled faintly, letting the warmth return to my chest. The storm had begun, and this time it was mine to control. My life looked simple from the outside, and I liked it that way. I lived alone in a modest, craftsman-style house tucked in a quiet neighborhood of Portland, Oregon. The street was lined with old maple trees that turned gold in the fall, and most of my neighbors were retired teachers, mail carriers, or war veterans who had lived there for decades. They waved politely when I watered my garden or walked my small dog, assuming I was just another kind widow living off Social Security. I never corrected them. It was easier that way. Inside, my home was warm and filled with the faint scent of lavender polish and old books. But behind one plain oak door at the end of the hallway was a room no one ever entered. That room was my true world. 3 monitors glowed quietly on the desk, displaying stock tickers and property dashboards. On the shelves were real estate deeds, notarized wills, and legal documents, including a letter of inheritance from my late brother Thomas. He had owned a small construction company, nothing impressive back then, but before he passed away, he signed over 2 parcels of land in Arizona and a small office building in Texas. After the pandemic, their values skyrocketed. I often looked at those papers, feeling both gratitude and a trace of sorrow. Thomas had always said I was the only one in the family who truly understood patience. That patience became my greatest asset. I started investing in tech stocks back in 2010, right after the crash, when everyone else was afraid. I spent nights reading quarterly reports, following trends, learning to recognize when panic created opportunity. Over the years, that quiet discipline built a fortune. My portfolio was now worth nearly $8 million, but no one, not even Oliver, knew the full extent of it. I had learned early that wealth only invites noise, jealousy, and manipulation. So I smiled when people assumed I was just frugal, when they offered to help me fix my fence or carry my groceries. Let them think I was poor. In a world that worshipped appearances, invisibility was my armor. Oliver was 34, the age when a man is supposed to have everything figured out. To the outside world, he looked successful, a mid-level manager at a renewable energy investment firm in downtown Portland. He wore tailored suits, spoke with quiet confidence, and drove a silver Tesla that gleamed like a badge of modern ambition. But behind that polished image was a man constantly torn between duty and pressure, between his mother and his wife. He loved me, I never doubted that. Every Sunday he called, even if it was just to ask whether I had taken my medication or to complain about traffic. Sometimes he stopped by after work, pretending it was on his way home, always carrying groceries or flowers. Yet his visits grew shorter after he married Hannah Matthews. Her family was wealthy, socially connected, the kind that believed power excused cruelty. Her father, Jonathan Matthews, owned a series of logistics companies and liked to remind everyone of it. Cold, exacting, and manipulative, he treated Oliver like a junior partner rather than a son-in-law. I saw it in the way Oliver's shoulders tensed whenever his phone buzzed during dinner. Out of respect, or perhaps fear, my son tried to keep peace. He didn't want Hannah to think I needed money, yet he secretly sent it anyway. Sometimes a few $100s would appear in my account from an anonymous transfer, though I always recognized the timing right after his quarterly bonus. Once, he even asked a friend from the bank to move funds without his name attached. I never spent a cent of it. Instead, I left the money untouched, stored as quiet proof of his goodness in a world that kept trying to make him hard. More than once, I told him, "Don't worry about me, Oliver. Take care of your own family." But I could see the guilt in his eyes, the exhaustion of trying to belong to two worlds that would never meet. The Matthews family saw me as a burden, something inconvenient he was supposed to outgrow. And though Oliver smiled, agreed with them, in silence, part of him resisted. I knew the war he was fighting, love against loyalty, pride against peace. Deep down, I feared what they might make of him if I stayed quiet too long. Hannah Matthews was 29 and had never known a life without comfort. She grew up in a world of chandeliers and champagne, where brand names replaced emotions and luxury stood for love. Her parents raised her to believe that image was power, and she learned early how to perform it. Every gesture, every word, every outfit was part of the same glossy play, one she carried perfectly into marriage. When she became Mrs. Sullivan, she didn't marry into my family as much as she absorbed my son into hers. After the wedding, Hannah rarely came to visit. When she did, it was never without cameras and never without control. Most of the time, she sent gifts, expensive but thoughtless, a box of imported chocolates here, a designer candle there, always accompanied by a polite text about how work in media kept her too busy. I stopped expecting sincerity from her long ago. Her life revolved around her online presence. 3 nights a week, she hosted live streams from her pristine kitchen, surrounded by curated lighting and spotless marble counters. There, she cooked simple dishes, dressed like a runway model, her voice soft but rehearsed. She talked about marriage, about success, about gratitude, and always made sure to mention how lucky her husband was to have a family like hers behind him. Viewers adored her. They saw a confident young woman with perfect hair and a perfect smile. But behind the ring light, Hannah's world was as fragile as glass. I once watched one of her videos by accident when it appeared on my suggested feed. She was filming a Family Appreciation Day vlog. She laughed, thanked her parents, showed childhood photos, and praised the values they taught her. My name never came up. Every mention of Oliver's past, of his home, of me, was cut, edited out as if erased. In her version of the story, I didn't exist. My son had been rewritten into a trophy husband, part of her curated image of perfection. It should have hurt, but instead, I felt an odd calm. Watching her smiling face framed by golden light, I understood that her greatest weakness was the same thing she worshipped: appearance. She lived for admiration, and one day, that would be the very thing that destroyed her. That winter came colder than any I could remember. The snow in Portland didn't fall often, but when it did, it blanketed the streets, thick and heavy. I was helping my elderly neighbor shovel her driveway when the sharp sting in my chest began. By nightfall, I was gasping for breath. The next morning, Julia, my late brother's daughter, now a nursing student, insisted on taking me to St. Mary's Hospital. It was one of the best in the state, all glass and white marble, the kind of place people said only the rich could afford. I didn't tell anyone that I paid the entire bill myself, including a private nurse. Independence to me was worth every cent. The diagnosis was pneumonia. Nothing new to the doctors, but heavy on my body. Julia stayed with me, her soft voice and steady hands, a comfort I didn't know I needed. She made sure the nurses followed the right medication schedule and brought fresh flowers every few days. It was a quiet recovery until Hannah called. Her voice came through the phone, sharp and dripping with condescension. "You really should have chosen a cheaper hospital, Mother. Who's paying for all that luxury?" I let her talk my eyes on the snow outside the window. The card that covered my expenses sat quietly in my bedside drawer, the same investment account I'd managed for 15 years. She didn't know about it, and she didn't need to. Let them think I was weak. I had long learned that underestimation could be a weapon. Meanwhile, Jonathan and Scarlett were busy talking behind my back, as Julia later overheard in the hallway. "Poor Oliver," they said, "having to shoulder the bills for a mother who can't let go of pride." They clicked their tongues like critics at a play, unaware that the financial office already had my signature on every payment slip. When I regained enough strength to walk, Julia showed me the printed hospital statements stamped and filed neatly in a folder. I asked her to keep a copy for me just in case. She looked puzzled, but I smiled. "Every act of cruelty leaves a trace," I said softly. "Sometimes all you need is proof of who you really are." She nodded, not understanding yet that this small folder, these simple receipts, would one day become the first crack in the Matthews family's facade. For the Matthews family, kindness was something to be tolerated, not cherished. From the very beginning, they treated Oliver's care for me as a nuisance, a distraction from the grand future they envisioned for him. To them, family meant usefulness, not affection. Every hour he spent visiting me, every call he made to check on my health, was seen as time stolen from their ambitions. I could sense it in their tone, the way they sighed when my name came up. To Scarlett, his mother's existence was a social inconvenience that needed to be managed, not respected. One afternoon during a family brunch, Scarlett leaned back in her chair and said with that perfect, chilly smile of hers, "Women shouldn't depend on their sons. It ruins their marriages." The room went quiet. Hannah smiled faintly, pretending to agree politely, but the satisfaction in her eyes was clear. I said nothing, but the words burrowed deep inside me. Dependence, as if love could be measured in the same way one measures a financial liability. I looked down at my plate, pretending not to notice Oliver's discomfort. He reached for his glass, his jaw tense, caught between loyalty and shame. After that, things changed. Hannah stopped pretending. When I sent her a jar of homemade orange marmalade that I had spent 2 days preparing, She texted back within minutes. "Don't worry, Mother. I don't eat homemade things. You keep it. No emojis, no warmth." When I knitted a scarf for her that winter, she left it behind on the chair after their visit. The message was clear, my gestures weren't welcome. At first, I thought it was just arrogance, the thoughtless behavior of youth, but little by little, I began to see the pattern. They weren't just ungrateful, they were strategic. The goal was simple: erase me from Oliver's world one quiet act at a time. Make him believe that caring for his mother was a burden, that my presence was an obstacle to his success. Turn his love into guilt, his compassion into shame. It was a slow, deliberate kind of cruelty wrapped in civility. That night, I sat in my kitchen, the jar of untouched marmalade still on the counter. I realized I wasn't dealing with indifference anymore, I was facing a plan. And if they wanted a quiet war, I would give them one. After I left the hospital, the world outside seemed colder than before, though the snow had already melted. Hannah and the Matthews family filled their days with celebrations: Christmas dinners, Scarlett's extravagant birthday, Thanksgiving feasts at their West-Linn mansion, where every glass sparkled and every laugh sounded rehearsed. I was never invited. Not really. A printed card would arrive in the mail, glossy and impersonal, addressed to Mrs. Mia Sullivan, with no handwriting, no note. It was enough to make things look proper, but never enough to mean inclusion. Still, I knew what those parties looked like. Hannah made sure of it. Her social media was a gallery of luxury crystal chandeliers, designer gowns, champagne towers, and endless captions about family and gratitude. In every photo, she stood beside her parents, her husband and their friends glowing under warm lights. Not once did my name appear. I had become the invisible piece of the puzzle, the shadow that didn't fit her picture-perfect world. Sometimes curiosity got the better of me. I would watch her live streams quietly, the screen lighting my dim living room. Family is everything, she would say, smiling as she leaned into Scarlett's shoulder, while Oliver sat politely at the edge, smiling, but not speaking. "We're so blessed to have such unity," she added, her words, rehearsed, her eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who believes their lie long enough to make it truth. Not once did she mention me, the woman who raised the man beside her. One evening, as I scrolled through her latest video, a small comment caught my eye. It came from my neighbor, an older woman who often brought me pies on weekends. She had written, "Your mother-in-law must be so proud of you." For a moment, my heart softened, but seconds later, the comment vanished, deleted. I refreshed the page twice, but it was gone. Hannah had erased me again. I didn't feel anger, not this time. Instead, I reached for my notebook and wrote down the date and time. Then I saved the video, copying the link into a private folder on my computer, the same one that held hospital bills, photos, and little fragments of evidence no one else thought to keep. I had learned that silence can be more powerful than confrontation. Let them believe I was too old, too gentle, too naive. They didn't know I was building something slowly, carefully beneath that silence. Oliver was being pulled apart by two worlds that refused to coexist. On one side was his duty as a son, the quiet love that had shaped him since childhood. On the other was the gleaming cage of the Matthews family, polished, powerful, and merciless. He tried to balance them at first, convincing himself that time would fix everything. But time, he soon realized, only deepened the divide. When I fell ill again that winter, he asked his boss for a few days off to help me settle back home. The next morning, Scarlett herself appeared at his office in her fur coat and pearls, gliding in like she owned the place. "We can't have Oliver distracted by trivial matters from his mother's side," she said sweetly, as if discussing the weather. "Our family name carries expectations." Her tone was polite, her smile sharp. By noon, everyone in the office knew his personal issues were up for discussion. The real blow came later that week. Jonathan, ever the strategist, sent an email to the board of directors. He didn't mention Oliver by name, but his meaning was clear enough. Some managers may be struggling to maintain focus due to family instability. We must ensure leadership integrity in our upcoming projects. Within days, Oliver was quietly removed from a key decision-making committee, the very project he had spent months developing. When he came to see me that weekend, I saw the exhaustion in his eyes. "They said it's just restructuring," he muttered, but his voice was hollow. I didn't need proof. I already knew whose hands were behind it. Yet fate has its strange allies. Among his colleagues was a man named Ethan, a quiet analyst who had always admired Oliver's work. Late one evening, Ethan slipped a printed copy of the internal email into Oliver's briefcase. "You didn't get this from me," he whispered before walking away. It was the first crack in the Matthews family's glass castle, small but real. That night, Oliver sat in his car for hours, the paper trembling in his hands. He finally saw what I had seen all along, that love, when mixed with control, turns to chains. I didn't say "I told you so." Instead, I poured him tea, my silence saying everything words could not. I was admitted to the hospital again that spring. A relapse the doctors said was nothing serious, but I could see the worry on Oliver's face as he sat by my bed. He looked thinner, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion not just from work, but from the invisible weight he carried at home. I knew that weight well. Every time the phone rang and Hannah's name appeared, his shoulders tensed, his voice turned careful. He was living between obedience and shame, and it was breaking him. "Go back to work, Oliver," I told him softly one morning when he brought me breakfast. "You shouldn't stay here all day. Julia's helping me and I'm fine." He looked at me torn, searching for truth in my face. I smiled and lied because sometimes love means setting someone free, even if it means standing alone. Julia, my niece, was capable and kind, but I hadn't really needed her. What I needed was for my son to breathe again, away from the cage his marriage had become. When he finally agreed to leave, promising to check in later, I waited until the door closed and let out a long breath. The silence in the room was almost comforting. Yet beneath that quiet, a thought began to settle in. Something about Hannah had changed. Her voice over the phone had become sharper, almost brittle, as if the mask of civility she wore for years was starting to crack. She no longer hid her disdain. The last time she visited, she stood by the door instead of sitting near me, scrolling through her phone while pretending to care. "You should rest more, Mother," she said without looking up. "It must be hard not having much to do all day." The words stung, not for what they meant, but for how easily they rolled off her tongue, casual cruelty disguised as concern. I said nothing. Experience had taught me that silence unsettles the arrogant more than confrontation ever could. But when she left, I couldn't shake the feeling that her rudeness was not just pride, it was the beginning of something else, something darker. There was a calculation behind her eyes, a restless edge that told me this woman wasn't content with simply disrespecting me. She wanted control over Oliver, over our lives, over everything that tied him to his past. As I lay there listening to the distant hum of the hospital machines, I promised myself one thing: I might be old, but I wasn't blind. And no matter how polite my silence seemed, it would not last forever. The first time I watched the footage, I had to pause halfway through. My hands trembled not from weakness this time, but from disbelief. The hidden camera installed weeks ago by Julia for safety monitoring had captured far more than I expected. On the small screen, the truth unfolded in cold digital clarity. There was Hannah stepping into my hospital room with that rehearsed smile, only for her face to harden the moment the nurse turned away. "She doesn't need all that food," she said sharply. "Cut her portion in half. It's not like she burns calories lying in bed all day." The nurse hesitated, but Hannah's tone left no room for argument. Later, I watched her berate Julia, her voice dripping with arrogance. "You charge this much to take care of a poor old woman. I should have hired someone else." Julia said nothing, lowering her head, but the humiliation hung heavy in the air. I clenched my fist as I listened, not from anger, but from resolve. For too long, I had allowed cruelty to disguise itself as concern. Then came the call. One lazy afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the sterile white floor, the camera caught Hannah pacing the hallway, phone pressed to her ear. "My mother-in-law keeps getting sick just to stay in that fancy hospital," she said, her tone light but venomous. "Maybe she's trying to milk my husband and me. Some people just don't know their place." On the other end, her friend laughed, encouraging her. Hannah smiled. "Honestly, if I make a video called 'My Broke Pretentious Mother-in-Law,' it'll go viral. People love stories like that." The room filled with laughter. Cold, echoing laughter that made my stomach twist. Julia found me watching it that evening. I didn't cry. Instead, I rewound the clip and pressed save, then uploaded every file to a private cloud account Patrick Ellis had helped me set up. Patrick, my lawyer and old friend, later confirmed what I suspected. "These recordings are fully admissible," he said, after reviewing the files. "They clearly show emotional abuse toward an elder. If you want to file a claim, we can begin immediately." I didn't answer right away. Outside the window, dusk painted the city in shades of gray. "Not yet," I finally said. "Let them keep believing I'm too weak to fight back." My reflection in the glass looked older than before, but my eyes, steady clear, belonged to someone reborn. The evidence would wait. I would wait. But the truth, now immortalized on camera, would never fade. The morning began with the sound of polite footsteps and artificial concern. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw them, Hannah, Scarlett, and Jonathan, all dressed as if they were attending a board meeting, not visiting a hospital patient. Hannah carried a leather folder instead of flowers. Scarlett wore her pearls. Jonathan's expression was the same tight smile he used in photographs for his company's press releases. They stood at the foot of my bed, radiating superiority under the white hospital light. "We're just here to help with a few details." Jonathan began smoothly placing a stack of papers on my bedside table. "It's better for everyone if we transfer your insurance policy under Oliver's name. That way finances are easier to manage." Hannah chimed in, her tone falsely sweet. "Yes, Mother, it's really for your benefit. You shouldn't trouble yourself with such complicated paperwork." I straightened slowly, my hand resting on the blanket. "I appreciate the concern," I said calmly, "but my accounts are already managed. There's no need for change." The air grew heavier. Scarlett exchanged a look with her husband. Then Jonathan's mask cracked. He leaned closer, his voice sharp and low, but loud enough for the nearby patients to hear. "You should be reasonable, Mrs. Sullivan. Don't forget who supports your son. If you make this difficult, Oliver could lose everything, his job, his reputation." His words sliced through the sterile room like a blade. Heads turned. Nurses hesitated in the doorway. I felt my chest tighten, but not from fear. And then the door opened. Oliver walked in holding a small grocery bag of fruit and magazines. He froze for half a second before his face darkened. "What's going on here?" he demanded. No one answered. The silence stretched, suffocating. Then Jonathan said coldly, "We're trying to handle what your mother refuses to." Something in Oliver snapped. He dropped the bag onto the table with a loud thud. "Enough," he said, his voice rising, echoing through the ward. "No one talks to my mother like that. Not here, not ever." It was the first time I'd heard him raise his voice against them, a sound both fierce and freeing. Scarlett gasped. Jonathan stepped back, muttering something about consequences. "You'll regret this," he warned. Hannah grabbed Oliver's arm, forcing a trembling smile before dramatically collapsing against him. "Please don't fight," she whispered, pretending to faint. Theatrics, as always. I reached for the call button beside my bed, pressing it firmly. "Nurse," I said evenly when she entered, "please escort these people out. I need quiet to recover." My tone left no room for argument. For the first time, they obeyed. The room fell into silence, heavy, electric final. In that silence, I saw it clearly. The fear in their eyes, the strength in my son's, and in my reflection on the glass window, a woman who would no longer endure humiliation disguised as family. It was late when the office lights began to dim that hour, when silence hums louder than machines. Oliver was still at his desk, buried in spreadsheets, trying to prove himself yet again to a company that would never truly see him. The sound of footsteps broke his focus. Ethan Ward, his closest colleague, appeared at the doorway, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. His expression was uneasy, as if he'd been debating this conversation all evening. "Oliver," he said quietly, placing 1 cup on the desk. "I need to tell you something, and I don't want you to hear it from someone else." Oliver looked up weary. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "I saw Hannah last night. She was having dinner at the lakeside bar in Lake Oswego with Kyle, the new guy from marketing." He paused. "They weren't just colleagues, Oliver. They were holding hands." For a moment, Oliver laughed, short and defensive. "You must have misunderstood. Hannah's been under stress. She meets clients all the time." "I thought so too," Ethan said softly, "until I checked the company's parking footage. It caught them leaving together past midnight." He slid his phone across the table. On the screen, grainy security stills showed Hannah in her red coat, her hand resting on Kyle's arm, both of them smiling as they walked to her car. The world seemed to tilt. Oliver felt his pulse in his throat. "That's not proof," he muttered, but his voice was cracking. When Ethan left, the office felt unbearably empty. He sat there in the dark for a long time before finally unlocking his phone. The call log glowed back at him, long conversations, hours after midnight, the same unknown number repeated again and again, and then he saw it, the name Kyle. Every call, every lie disguised as business replayed in his head. The woman he defended at every dinner, the one who humiliated his mother and mocked his loyalty, was now betraying him too. The final thread of illusion snapped. The next morning, Ethan stopped by his office again, voice low. "There's more," he said. "Jonathan knows. He's been covering it up. He doesn't want the story leaking, says it could damage the company's image." Oliver stared at him speechless. For the first time, he saw the truth laid bare, that his entire marriage had been a business deal. His loyalty, nothing more than leverage. He wasn't a husband. He was an investment. The night I opened the files Julia had secretly copied, I didn't expect to find the kind of poison that hides behind laughter. She had managed to back up several clips from the hospital security feed and a few message threads between Hannah and her friends. I sat at my desk, the glow of the computer screen reflecting off my glasses, and pressed play. There she was, Hannah sitting in her spotless kitchen, a wine glass in hand, laughing with the same ease she used to charm people online. "I just need to pretend to love Oliver a few more months," she said, smirking. "Once Dad's project is finalized, I'm done babysitting him." Her friend giggled, asking what she'd do if Oliver found out. Hannah shrugged. "Please, he's too naive. I could cry once and he'd apologize." The next recording was worse. It was an audio clip captured through the microphone of the same security system that once watched over me. I pressed play, and her voice filled the room. Cool, measured, cruel. "If Oliver quits the company, Dad loses his shares. I need to keep him loyal somehow. Maybe the bed will do." The words hit harder than any slap could. I froze my hands, trembling slightly, then steadied them on the desk. My breath came slow, even controlled. For a moment, I could hear my own heartbeat over the sound of her laughter. The world I had carefully held together, the hope that maybe things could heal, collapsed quietly inside me. But instead of breaking, something inside me solidified. "They think I'm just a sick old woman," I whispered to the empty room. "But they don't know I used to manage million-dollar portfolios before they even learned to read a balance sheet." I called Patrick Ellis the next morning. He listened carefully as I played the recording through the phone. When the last word faded, he said calmly, "Mrs. Sullivan, if this audio can be authenticated, it qualifies as exploitation through marriage and financial manipulation under Oregon civil law. You could press charges." I looked out the window where the first light of morning turned the frost on the glass into silver. For years I had chosen silence as a shield, believing patience was power. But now, silence would be my weapon. I closed the laptop slowly, the faintest smile touching my lips. "Let's not rush," I told Patrick. "They wanted a game. Let's see how well they play when the rules change." It started with something small, a misplaced envelope that shouldn't have been in my mailbox. Julia was helping me organize medical bills when she found it tucked between a hospital statement and a charity flyer. The envelope was addressed to Matthews and Comby Media Holdings, but stamped with my home address. Curiosity and years of experience in finance told me to open it. Inside was a printed bank statement marked confidential, bearing the elegant but unmistakable signature of Scarlett Matthews. I adjusted my glasses and began to read. The numbers told a story more honest than words ever could. Repeated transfers between the Matthews family business and a private account under Hannah's name, each labeled as Media Partnership Fund. At first glance, they seemed harmless routine. But the irregular timing, the round numbers, and the looping transfers through secondary accounts revealed a pattern I recognized instantly: structured transactions designed to disguise taxable income. Small-scale money laundering. Tax evasion neatly dressed as business. Julia frowned. "Aunt Mia, is that serious?" I folded the statement carefully. "More than serious, dear. This is the kind of mistake that sends people to prison if the wrong person finds out." That evening, I called Patrick Ellis. He listened in silence as I described the document, then said in his calm, lawyerly tone, "Let me check with someone I trust in the IRS." 2 days later, he called back. "You were right, Mia. The Matthews family was warned 3 years ago for inaccurate expense reporting. They were lucky to escape with only a fine." I stared at the envelope lying on my desk, the paper now slightly crumpled from my grip. "Luck doesn't last forever," I murmured. A few nights later, when Oliver came to visit, I decided to test the waters. We were having tea when I mentioned it casually, as if discussing the weather. "I heard the Matthews Company had some accounting issues a few years back." "Strange, isn't it?" He froze mid-sip. The cup clinked softly as he set it down. "What did you say?" "Oh, nothing important. I just wonder if that's why some of your bonuses went through Hannah's account instead of directly to you. She did mention once that it was easier for her father to handle things that way." The silence that followed was long and heavy. I watched the realization dawn on him, slow and painful. "So the company pays me," he whispered, "but the money goes to Hannah's account first?" "Yes," I said gently, "which means legally it's hers, not yours." For the first time, he looked at me not as a fragile mother, but as someone who had just shown him the battlefield he'd been standing on all along. Hannah's arrogance had grown into something almost theatrical. She had begun to treat cruelty as if it were a form of performance, confident that no one would dare challenge her. One afternoon, while I was resting in my hospital room, I heard her voice echoing from the hallway. She was on the phone, speaking far too loudly for a private conversation. "My mother-in-law doesn't need anything fancy to survive," she said, with a mocking laugh. "Give her a few packs of instant noodles and she'll be fine. People like her don't deserve expensive medicine anyway." I didn't move or speak. I simply closed my eyes and let the words wash over me like cold water. For a long time, I had learned that humiliation could be more revealing than confession. What she didn't know was that Julia, who had gone to buy coffee, had stopped right outside the door and heard everything. The younger woman froze for a moment, disbelief turning into quiet rage. Without a word, she pulled out her phone and began recording. The conversation continued for several minutes, Hannah laughing, gossiping, unaware she was documenting her own downfall. When the call ended, Julia saved the recording directly to the secure cloud we shared. A few hours later, Hannah posted a story online, a black background white text, and a caption written in that smug, perfect tone she reserved for her followers. Some people should learn their place. Poor and pretending to be classy, embarrassing. Her fans assumed she was referring to a coworker. But I knew. The timing, the words, the disdain, it was all for me. I watched the clip once and then turned off my phone. It wasn't anger that filled me, but clarity. That evening, Patrick Ellis came by with his briefcase and a calm smile. "You should say nothing, Mia," he advised after listening to Julia's recording. "People like Hannah don't need enemies, they build their own gallows one word at a time. Let her speak. The more she talks, the deeper she digs." I nodded slowly, "So I wait." He smiled. "You wait and you keep your records safe." That night, the city outside was quiet. Snowflakes swirling under the streetlights. I thought about how easily people destroy themselves when blinded by arrogance. Hannah believed she was untouchable, that I was just an old woman too weak to fight back. She was right about one thing: I was quiet. But quiet doesn't mean powerless. Sometimes silence is the loudest strategy of all. Patrick sat across from me with the kind of calm that comes from years in the courtroom, and he said, "We should not meet cruelty with a spectacle of anger." He recommended strategy, not drama. He advised that every recording, every bank statement, every screenshot be authenticated and cataloged, and that I open a legal fund to pay for investigations and the careful work of reporters and accountants. I nodded, feeling a clarity that was almost physical, a relief, like breath returning to a lung that had held too much for too long. I told him to set up the account under a trust name he trusted, and to move quickly, but quietly. He handled the paperwork with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime turning chaos into leverage. After that first meeting, I began to move in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I called 2 local investigative journalists I had seen expose corruption on public television. I did not make accusations or hand them files. Instead, I planted small seeds, hints about irregular expense reports and about a pattern of emotional coercion against an elderly patient. I suggested that these were leads worth looking into, and I let them follow the trail. I was careful to use intermediaries and coded language, always maintaining distance. The journalists showed interest, and they said they would check public filings and follow up on sources. I slept badly that week, but slept with a plan which was better than sleeplessness, born of helplessness. The next move was quieter and required patience, which I had in abundance. Using an anonymous legal vehicle that I had established years earlier for investment privacy, I began to accumulate shares in Matthews Media Holdings. Nothing flashy. 15% in total, purchased in small blocks over months through different brokerages, and with the help of a fiduciary who had managed my brother S. estate. Legally, it was a clean operation, but it had bite. I became, without anyone knowing, a meaningful silent owner. That status gave me options that public anger could never buy. It would allow me, when the time came, to call for audits or to vote on governance measures. Power quietly acquired is often the most effective kind. On evenings when the house was quiet and the snow tapped gently against the window, I would sit in my little study and look at the portfolio statements and the sealed envelopes of evidence. I practiced saying the words that would guide our actions. I told Patrick that I did not want to humiliate them in public for its own sake. I wanted them to fall because their own choices had set the trap. Let their arrogance unravel in daylight. Let the law do the work. He smiled and closed his briefcase, saying that patience and proof would turn their performance into legal failure. I felt something like satisfaction, not bitter, but precise and cold. I did not need to shout to be heard. I needed only to wait and to press the right button when the time came. The plan was in motion, and the next chapter would be investigation and preparation. When I called Patrick Ellis, his voice carried the same calm authority I remembered from years ago when he had handled my late brother's estate. Sullivan, he said warmly, it's been a long time. I was wondering when you'd call me again, though I suspect this isn't a social chat. No, I replied, my tone steady. It's about family and justice. 2 days later, we met at a small tea house in downtown Portland, a quiet place with the faint smell of jasmine and rain-soaked wood. Patrick arrived exactly on time, briefcase in hand, his gray hair neatly combed, his eyes sharp as ever. He listened as I spoke, not interrupting once. I told him everything: the infidelity, the manipulation, the emotional abuse, the money laundering, the fraud, all of it. The words poured out like water from a dam, finally cracked open. When I finished, silence filled the room. Patrick took a slow breath, removed his glasses, and placed them carefully on the table. We'll do this the right way, he said finally. Everything legal, but nothing left standing. From that moment, our plan began to take form: deliberate, methodical, unstoppable. Patrick drew a diagram in his notebook, dividing it into 3 sections. First, he said, tapping his pen on the page, we document every instance of elder emotional abuse, dates, recordings, witnesses. That becomes the moral backbone of the case. Second, we pursue the tax fraud, he continued. The bank statements you found and the company's irregular transfers, those go to federal investigators. We'll go straight to the IRS instead of the state revenue office. Jonathan may have friends in Salem, but not in Washington, D.C. And third, I added quietly, Oliver. Patrick nodded. Yes. We prepare a divorce case that protects him completely. No joint assets, no loopholes, no exposure. Once the other 2 fronts open, Hannah will lose her leverage. He leaned back, studying me for a long moment. You've waited years to strike, haven't you? I smiled faintly. I've waited long enough to make sure it counts. When we left, the rain had started to fall soft and rhythmic against the windows. Patrick shook my hand firmly. From now on, you're not fighting alone, he said. You have the law, and me. As he walked away, I looked at his retreating figure, the city lights glimmering on the wet pavement. For the first time in years, I felt something fierce and alive inside me. Not anger, but resolve. The kind that doesn't burn out. The kind that builds. I've always believed that money, when used wisely, is quieter than words. It doesn't boast, it protects. So when everything around me began to crumble, I didn't panic. I planned. The first thing I did was secure what I had built. I called my financial advisor and instructed him to prepare the documents for an irrevocable trust, a structure no one could touch once it was sealed. I transferred 30% of my tech stocks into it and named Oliver as the sole beneficiary. When the papers were signed and notarized, those shares no longer belonged to me. They were legally untouchable. Even if the Matthews family tried to sue for marital compensation during the divorce, they would find nothing to claim. I smiled when the lawyer confirmed it. Let them think I was weak. They had no idea they were already shut out. Next, I hired an independent accountant, a sharp woman named Teresa Boyd, known in Portland for her precision and ethics. Together, we went through every financial record I owned, from property deeds to brokerage statements. Teresa helped me assemble legal proof showing that all my income and assets were earned long before Oliver married Hannah. I wanted it in writing, stamped, certified, and stored in multiple locations. When we finished, I looked at the neat stack of folders on my desk and felt something rare, complete control. Then came the quiet part of my plan. I sold one of my rental homes in Texas, the one my late brother had helped me buy years ago. It was a good deal, clean, profitable, unremarkable. I transferred the funds into a separate account labeled Medical Emergency Fund. On paper, it looked like a safety net for hospital bills. In truth, it was my war chest, a legal fund that would fuel everything to come. Lawyers, investigators, journalists. Every dollar had a purpose. Every cent was a step toward justice. When I met Patrick at our usual cafe, he arrived with his calm smile and a folder full of revelations. I had my team review the Matthews Company filings, he said, spreading the papers across the table. They're faking depreciation losses on assets that don't exist. It's textbook fraud. I stirred my tea, slowly feeling the warmth seep through the porcelain. So they're lying to the IRS. Worse, Patrick replied. They're lying to everyone. And if we hand this to federal investigators, they could lose their business license. I leaned back, letting his words settle like dust in the light. Then we won't rush, I said. We'll let them keep digging. The deeper the hole, the easier the fall. That night, as I reviewed the trust papers once more, I realized something. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was reclaiming power quietly, methodically, and without apology. People like the Matthews family believed that silence meant surrender. But I knew better. Silence was strategy, and I had perfected it. Patrick once told me that truth alone rarely wins. It needs witnesses brave enough to stand beside it. So when the time came to build our case, we began with the people who had seen, heard, and endured the cruelty that others pretended not to notice. Patrick suggested 3 names: my private nurse, my niece Julia, and Ethan Ward, Oliver's trusted colleague. They're not just witnesses, he said. They're the spine of your case. Each of them carries a piece of the truth that can't be erased. I started with Julia. When she arrived at my home, her face was pale but resolute. She had been there during my worst nights at the hospital, the ones when Hannah ordered everyone around like staff at her private estate. Aunt Mia, she said softly, I can't stay quiet anymore. She handed Patrick a flash drive. Inside were video clips and nursing logs she had kept as part of her training records. One line stood out, written in the nurse's hand. Patient not permitted afternoon meal per daughter-in-law's order. Another entry mentioned a sedative the dosage doubled without medical reason. Julia looked away as Patrick read it. I was there, she whispered. Hannah told me it was for your own good. Next came the nurse, a woman named Clara, who had tended to me for nearly 3 months. She confirmed every word, providing her own signed statement and care logs. She had written the dosage adjustment herself, noting how unusual it was. I didn't dare question her, Clara admitted. She said she was managing the bills and that I'd lose my job if I didn't obey. Ethan's testimony arrived a few days later. He met Patrick at his office downtown, a place lined with dark wood and silence. Ethan wasn't a man of drama, but his email evidence spoke louder than any courtroom speech could. He submitted copies of internal messages from Jonathan Matthews, emails pressuring senior managers to handle Oliver's personal distractions, warning that family loyalty should never conflict with company interest. One line in particular sealed it. If his mother becomes an issue, we'll remind him who signs his paycheck. It was corporate intimidation disguised as family advice. Patrick reviewed everything with a lawyer's patience, then smiled the kind of smile that meant progress. We're ready for the next step, he said. I'll file for a preservation order. The order, once approved, forced Matthews and Company to freeze all internal data, emails, reports, accounting records, everything. They couldn't delete or alter a single file without committing obstruction. Patrick leaned back in his chair. "They've spent years hiding behind power and connections," he said quietly. "Now they'll trip over their own secrets." I didn't need to say anything. The truth was no longer a fragile thing to protect. It had grown teeth. When Oliver finally sat across from me with his shoulders collapsed and his face a map of shame, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and relief. He had always been strong in small ways, the kind of strength that folds laundry and remembers birthdays. That evening, he looked like a man who had been knocked loose from his own life. He said he was sorry not for a single insult or a single cold meal, but for not listening to the small alarms I had been sounding for years. He apologized for being slow to see the truth about his wife and her family. I reached for his hand and did not speak. There was a long silence that tasted like rain, and then he began to tell me everything Ethan and Julia had shared. Patrick suggested that Oliver step back from work for a time, and that suggestion felt like a blessing. We needed him focused, not torn, and we needed his testimony to be clear and calm. Patrick explained the legal language, softly saying that emotional abuse and financial manipulation were valid grounds for separation and for building a civil case. Oliver agreed without drama. He signed the paperwork for a temporary leave and prepared a legal declaration stating that he would live apart from Hannah while the case proceeded. He told me he felt both frightened and liberated, as if a heavy fog had been lifted from his chest. When he moved back into my house, the place that used to belong to quiet routines, it felt different. He sorted files with the precision of someone learning to protect what mattered. He helped me organize receipts, match timestamps on recordings to calendar entries, and label every email and text for Patrick's review. Watching him became an act of healing for both of us. Where humiliation had once made him small, participation made him formidable. He took oath statements from Julia and from the nurse, sat with Patrick to review strategy, and practiced speaking plainly in ways that a judge would understand. He was learning the language of truth and litigation, and once he found that voice, I could see him stand straighter. The most painful shift came with a letter that arrived in my mailbox. Scarlett had written it by hand, angry and elegant in the same breath. She accused me of destroying her daughter's happiness and threatened consequences. The words were venomous, but also clumsy, as if rage had moved faster than judgment. Patrick advised that the letter be preserved, and so it was. We photographed every line and placed the original in an evidence envelope. That threatening hand had given us a tangible piece of proof. It showed intent and intimidation, and once documented, it no longer belonged only to her. It became part of the legal record. There were nights when Oliver would sit on the porch and stare at the dark street, the old man he had become in my son, evident in the way he worried over every minor decision. But there were also mornings when he laughed small and honest, and I could feel something like a future being stitched back together. He had moved from silence into testimony, from shame into action. He was my son, and he had become in the quietest and strongest way the center of our case. That day, I understood that families can break, and sometimes they rebuild with different pieces. We were building something new from the rubble of betrayal. I learned long ago that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. So while Patrick and I built our case in silence, I began to play a different kind of game, one that required patience, performance, and a convincing mask. I kept my routine simple. I still wore my old cardigans and walked with the same slow, careful steps when people saw me in public. I smiled politely at the grocery store, accepted help even when I didn't need it, and spoke in the soft, almost fragile tone that made people underestimate me. Neighbors pitied me. Hannah's friends thought I was sweet but clueless. That was exactly what I wanted. The weaker they believed I was, the more confident and careless the Matthews family became. Patrick understood the plan without me having to explain. He arranged for small, legally approved recording devices to be used during any public meeting or social event where the two families interacted. "You won't provoke them," he said. "You'll just let them speak." And they did. Jonathan's sharp voice was captured, telling Oliver that family loyalty should come before moral lectures. Scarlett was recorded whispering that I needed to be put in a care home before she causes more trouble. Every insult, every veiled threat, every attempt to humiliate me, all neatly preserved, each file admissible in an Oregon courtroom. Hannah, meanwhile, became her own undoing. She couldn't resist the attention, the glamour of being the center of her own narrative. On TikTok, she posted a video laughing with friends, holding a champagne glass, bragging that some people are just too easy to fool. The poor, sick mother-in-law doesn't even know what's coming. It was supposed to be private, shared only with her social circle. But nothing on the internet ever stays hidden. One of the journalists Patrick had quietly tipped off later found the clip, and it became part of the official media archive, evidence not just of greed, but of moral decay. The night everything came full circle. I was alone in the living room, reviewing security footage from my house. The camera caught a flicker of motion, a shadow near the desk. It was Hannah, her posture cautious, her face half lit by the glow of her phone. She was taking photos of the legal folders I'd deliberately left on the table, meaningless documents, but good bait. She thought she was being clever, that her secret mission would finally give her leverage. I sat back watching the footage, calm and unshaken. The timestamp and footage were clear, unauthorized entry photographing private materials. In legal terms, it was trespassing and invasion of privacy. In personal terms, it was checkmate. I turned off the screen and poured myself a cup of tea. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the heater. For the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I wasn't a victim waiting to be rescued. I was the quiet architect of their downfall, and they had built the trap with their own arrogance. I learned long ago that the most powerful trap is the one that looks harmless. So I decided to become exactly what they wanted, to see a poor, fragile old woman who posed no threat. I wore my simplest clothes, soft wool cardigans, shoes with worn soles. I spoke gently, even when my voice wanted to shake the walls. When neighbors greeted me, I smiled kindly. When Hannah's friends saw me at the market, I thanked them for helping me reach the top shelf, pretending I needed their pity. Every gesture, every polite nod was part of the disguise. The Matthews family had always fed on arrogance. All I needed was to let them choke on it. Patrick called it the silent net. He arranged for a set of discreet, legally approved recording devices to be installed in public meeting areas, the cafe near my home, the restaurant where our families occasionally met, even the community center where Scarlett liked to flaunt her charity work. In Oregon, as long as one party consents, recordings are admissible. And I was always that consenting party. Every insult, every threat, every whisper that revealed their contempt was safely stored and time-stamped. When Patrick played back the first sample, Hannah's shrill laughter filled his office. "She's harmless," Hannah bragged. "An old woman like her doesn't even understand half of what's going on. Soon all that's left will be ours anyway." It didn't stop there. Emboldened by her own ignorance, Hannah began sharing her confidence online. One night, Julia showed me a TikTok. Hannah had posted a flashy video of her sipping champagne, captioned, can't wait to finally take over what's been sitting in the wrong hands. Some people just don't know when to let go. Her followers filled the comments with hearts and praise. But what she didn't know was that one of Patrick's journalist contacts had already saved the clip, flagging it for ethical misconduct. That post would later become Exhibit C in a case showing not just greed, but moral rot. Still, the final piece came by accident. One evening, as I sat reviewing my home security feed, I noticed motion in the living room. Hannah had stopped by earlier that day under the pretense of checking on me. On the screen, I saw her glance around, open her purse, and quietly lift her phone to take photos of the documents I had left on the table. Trust papers, property titles, legal correspondence. She thought I was asleep upstairs. But every movement was captured clearly by the hidden camera near the mantelpiece. Trespassing, invasion of privacy, felony-level arrogance. I watched in silence, my tea cooling beside me. There was no anger left, only precision. The trap had closed without a sound. The next morning, I sent the footage to Patrick with a simple note: checkmate. I remember the day of the shareholders' meeting as clearly as if it were yesterday, the day masks fell off, and silence finally spoke louder than power. Patrick called it an internal review, but I knew it was the strike we'd been preparing for. The meeting was held at the Matthews headquarters downtown, a glass building that gleamed like arrogance itself. I arrived quietly dressed in my usual modest cardigan, the image of harmlessness I had cultivated so carefully. They didn't suspect a thing. Inside, the air was tight with self-importance. Jonathan sat at the head of the long mahogany table, Hannah beside him, dressed in white like a saint in a commercial. Scarlett fussed with her pearl necklace, pretending not to notice me. Patrick stood at the far end, calm, collected, carrying only a slim folder and the look of a man who had come to deliver facts, not favors. Thank you all for joining this financial review. Patrick began, his tone polite, almost conversational. We've been conducting a standard audit as required under state compliance. However, he clicked the remote and the projector lit up the room. On the screen appeared line after line of corporate expenses, advertising partnerships, brand collaborations, media promotions. Each one led to the same destination, Hannah Matthews' personal account. A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Someone whispered, "That can't be right." Jonathan's face drained of color, then flushed red. "This is a mistake," he snapped, standing abruptly. "Those are authorized transfers, company approved." Patrick didn't raise his voice. He simply pulled another document from his folder. "Authorized by whom, Mr. Matthews?" He laid out a printed chain of internal emails, each one linking back to Jonathan's signature. At the bottom was the seal of the IRS. "We contacted the agency for verification," Patrick said evenly. "They confirmed these transactions are now under federal review for falsified expense reporting and commercial tax evasion." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Hannah's sharp inhale. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. You have no right to expose this here." Patrick smiled thinly. "On the contrary, Mrs. Matthews. This is a shareholders' meeting. The right to transparency is not optional." Then came the moment none of us expected. The door opened quietly, and a woman with a press badge stepped inside. "Excuse me," she said, holding up a microphone. "I'm Lydia from the Oregon Business Chronicle. We received this report from an anonymous source early this morning." Every head turned. The flash of cameras followed. Jonathan froze. Scarlett clutched her pearls. And Hannah, always so composed, so cruelly confident, went pale as marble. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap. No gloating, no triumph. Just the quiet certainty that the truth, once freed, doesn't need to shout. The story was out now. There would be no covering it, no denying it, no undoing it. The game was over. The courthouse smelled of paper-old wood and nervous breath. That morning, the crowd outside was larger than anyone expected. Reporters lined the marble hallway, their cameras and notebooks ready. The case was listed simply as Sullivan versus Matthews, but by then, everyone in Oregon already knew what it meant. It wasn't just a divorce. It was the unmasking of a dynasty. Inside, Oliver sat beside Patrick, his shoulders squared, but his eyes heavy. Across the aisle, Hannah looked immaculate, in a beige suit, her lawyer whispering strategies in her ear. She smiled faintly when she saw the press waiting. To her, this was still a performance. She had no idea the curtain was about to fall. The judge, a composed woman in her 50s, began the hearing briskly. We will first review evidence related to claims of emotional and financial abuse. Patrick stood buttoning his jacket, and his calm voice filled the room. Your Honor, we will present testimony from the primary caregiver, Nurse Clara Hill, followed by video evidence from a family member. Clara walked to the stand, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. Mrs. Matthews instructed me to cut Mrs. Sullivan's meals in half, she said, her tone brittle with guilt. She also doubled the dosage of sedatives without authorization, claiming the patient was too talkative. A murmur rose from the courtroom. Disgust, disbelief, and something deeper, collective shame. The judge frowned. Did you comply? Clara hesitated, eyes wet. I was afraid to lose my job, but I wrote it all down in the care log. Patrick handed the document to the court clerk. The log is time-stamped and verified. Then came Julia's turn. My niece stepped forward and placed a tablet on the evidence screen. This video was taken from a private group chat recorded 6 months ago. She pressed play. Hannah's face appeared laughing into her phone camera. My mother-in-law acts rich, but she lives like a beggar. Maybe I'll send her another box of instant noodles for Christmas. The words hung in the air like acid. Someone in the back gasped. An elderly woman covered her mouth, whispering, "That poor lady." The entire room seemed to shift, sympathy sliding toward Oliver and me, disgust anchoring itself firmly on Hannah. Patrick, ever patient, waited for the noise to settle. Then he pulled out a final folder. Your Honor, this document was received from the IRS this morning. The judge gestured for him to proceed. It confirms that the Matthews family businesses are now under federal investigation for tax fraud and falsified financial reporting. He let the words sink in before continuing. Given these findings, we argue that financial manipulation in this marriage was part of a broader pattern, one extending far beyond domestic matters. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed through the glass panel at the back door. Hannah's lawyer whispered something frantic, but her composure broke. She turned to Jonathan and Scarlett, both pale and speechless. Oliver looked at me from across the room. No triumph, just quiet release, like a weight had finally lifted. When the judge called for recess, the tension shattered into whispers. The Matthews name was no longer untouchable. Justice, though slow, had finally caught up. The courtroom had turned into a storm. The silence from a few moments ago had cracked open into chaos. Whispers, gasps, the shuffling of chairs. Jonathan Matthews, the man who once entered every room like he owned the world, was now sweating through his tailored suit. He slammed his palm on the table, his voice rising in a brittle panic. We only made accounting errors, he insisted. This isn't tax evasion, it's a misunderstanding. His words echoed desperate and hollow. Patrick stood calmly, his face as composed as ever. A misunderstanding, he repeated, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise. Let's clarify then. He motioned to the court technician. A clip played over the speakers. Jonathan's voice cold and unmistakable. If you don't play along, Oliver, you'll lose your job and everything that comes with it. The room froze. Even Hannah flinched. Scarlett suddenly broke down her mascara running as she pointed a trembling finger toward Oliver. "He destroyed my daughter's life. He poisoned our family," she cried. Her dramatics filled the room for a moment until Patrick quietly raised his hand. "Your Honor, permission to play one more recording." The judge nodded. The next file projected onto the screen was the letter Scarlett had written to me weeks before, her own voice reading it aloud for all to hear. "You will regret ruining my daughter's happiness. I'll make you pay one way or another." Her sobs stopped mid-breath. The irony was cruel and complete. The same letter meant to intimidate me had now become the rope that pulled their family down. And then came Hannah. She was trembling. Her hands clutched around her phone like a lifeline. "Those are lies," she said, her voice cracking. "I deleted everything. I didn't do anything wrong." Patrick glanced toward the judge. "Then if there's nothing to hide, let's check your deleted files." The technician connected her phone to the monitor. Within seconds, the screen filled with images: Hannah holding hands with Kyle, kissing him in a dimly lit bar. Text messages that read, "I can't stand living in that old woman's shadow any longer." Gasps rippled through the audience. The press cameras clicked furiously. Hannah covered her face, shaking her head, muttering, "No, no, no." But it was too late. The judge's gavel struck once, calling for order, but the damage had already been done. A reporter near the back began streaming live. "Breaking news: the Matthews scandal deepens as new evidence confirms infidelity and financial fraud." Her voice blended with the sound of Hannah's scream. "No one is perfect," Hannah shouted through tears. For a second, the room went silent again. Then came the wave of whispers, pity from some, disgust from others. I sat still, my hands resting on my cane. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. Justice didn't need to be loud. In that moment, I saw the Matthews family crumble, not from my revenge, but from the weight of their own lies. Their empire had been built on deception, and now, layer by layer, it was gone. When the judge finally granted Oliver permission to speak, the room fell into a fragile silence. You could almost hear the hum of the ceiling fan above the jury box, the faint scratch of a reporter's pen stopping mid-word. My son stood straightening his tie, as if trying to hold himself together. For the first time in a long while, his voice didn't tremble. He walked to the center of the courtroom, the place where every lie and truth had collided over the past weeks. Hannah looked away, pretending to adjust her sleeve, but Oliver didn't let her hide. He fixed his gaze on her and began softly, almost tenderly. "I used to think money could buy respect," he said. The words came slow, deliberate. "But today I understand the most valuable thing my mother ever gave me wasn't money. It was dignity." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then somewhere in the back, a woman sniffled. Another nodded through tears. The silence broke into applause, quiet at first, then rising like a wave that filled every corner of the courtroom. Even the bailiff hesitated before calling for order. The judge didn't stop it. She just sat there, eyes heavy with something that looked a lot like compassion. I watched from my seat in the second row, wrapped in my light gray wool coat. My hands were clasped in my lap. I didn't smile, didn't gloat. I simply breathed. For so long I had fought battles in silence against humiliation, greed, and loneliness. And now, in that one clear moment, my son stood tall again. Not because I had saved him, but because he had finally remembered who he was. Reporters leaned forward, capturing every word, every frame. The cameras clicked. The microphones blinked red. One of the local news stations, KPTV Portland, happened to be recording the session live. Later, that clip, just 45 seconds long, would be replayed on every evening broadcast. The title that appeared on screen read, "A Son's Redemption." By nightfall, the video had flooded social media. Women across the state shared it with captions like, "Every mother deserves this moment, and this is what dignity looks like." I never expected any of it. I wasn't searching for fame. But sometimes truth finds its own audience. When the applause finally faded, Oliver stepped down and walked toward me. He didn't say a word. He simply reached for my hand, and I felt the warmth of his palm, steady, strong, alive. The courtroom, once so cold, now seemed filled with something softer. Maybe it was forgiveness. Maybe it was peace. Whatever it was, I knew that was enough. The judge's voice was steady, deliberate, the kind that made every word sound like the turning of a key in a locked door. This court finds sufficient evidence of emotional abuse, manipulation, and financial misconduct. Mrs. Hannah Matthews will forfeit all claims to shared marital assets and is hereby referred for criminal investigation under state and federal law. The gavel struck once, firm and final. The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Hannah's face drained of color, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Her lawyer whispered frantically, yet even he looked defeated. The air of privilege that had always surrounded the Matthews family was gone, replaced by silence and disbelief. Patrick, calm as ever, gathered his papers and glanced at me with the faintest nod. Justice, he had once told me, doesn't shout, it simply arrives when you least expect it. Within hours, the effects rippled through Portland's business world. The Matthews Corporation, long considered untouchable, was placed under a 6-month suspension pending tax investigation. Their stock plummeted overnight. Investors scrambled to withdraw funds. Major partners announced contract terminations citing ethical breaches. It was as if the empire they had built on deceit had begun to collapse brick by brick right before the public's eyes. By the next morning, headlines flooded every local paper and news site. Prominent business family under investigation for tax evasion and elder abuse. Matthews' empire on the brink, IRS confirms federal inquiry. Their family name, once synonymous with status and power, was now the punchline of dinner conversations and late-night talk shows. Hannah's own downfall came fast and mercilessly. The marketing firms that once courted her image cut all ties. Her sponsorships vanished. Former friends stopped returning calls. Videos resurfaced her mockery of me, her arrogance now replayed as cautionary clips about greed and moral decay. Scarlett and Jonathan faced their own reckoning, charged with falsifying company statements and coercion. The same people who once bowed to them now crossed the street to avoid them. Outside the courthouse, snow was falling softly, each flake catching the light like a reflection of something clean and restored. Oliver reached for my hand. For a long time, we didn't speak. The reporters were still there, cameras flashing, but none of that mattered anymore. The story wasn't about scandal. It was about survival, about truth, reclaiming its place after years of humiliation. We stood there as the courthouse lights glowed behind us, the chaos fading into the hush of winter. For the first time in years, I felt the simple weight of peace. We were no longer the victims in someone else's game. We had won not by revenge, but by justice finally coming home. The headlines came first, sharp, merciless, and impossible to ignore. Matthews family under federal investigation. Socialite daughter-in-law accused of elder abuse. The same media that once praised Hannah's flawless lifestyle now dissected her downfall in vivid detail. Brand partners terminated contracts overnight. Luxury companies deleted collaborations without a trace. The online world turned against her. The woman who had built her image on perfection was now the symbol of hypocrisy. Oliver, meanwhile, walked a quieter path. He resigned from his position before the board could dismiss him and started his own consulting firm downtown, a modest office with one assistant and a coffee maker that leaked, but it was his. Patrick helped him navigate the legal paperwork, and I introduced him to two of my old contacts from the investment community. Slowly, calls started coming in. The same people who had avoided him months earlier now returned his greetings with respect. For the first time, he didn't need the Matthews name to be seen. He stood on his own. As for me, peace didn't arrive like a celebration. It came like a quiet morning after a long storm. I didn't boast or talk about victory. Instead, I used what I had to protect what mattered. I created a trust for Oliver's new business-funded scholarships for young caregivers and donated to a local program supporting seniors facing abuse. When the media requested interviews, I declined most of them. I'm not a story, I told them. I'm just a mother who refused to disappear. But the public's perception shifted. Letters began arriving, some from women I'd never met, thanking me for standing up. They didn't see wealth anymore. They saw courage. Meanwhile, the Matthews family faced what they had earned. Their company's tax violations resulted in heavy penalties and public audits. Jonathan's board memberships were revoked. Scarlett was forced to sell her properties to cover legal fees. Hannah's influencer career collapsed entirely. Her accounts were flooded with angry comments, sponsorships vanished, and even her closest friends avoided her. The same spotlight she once sought now exposed every crack of her vanity. Karma didn't shout. It simply mirrored back the truth. One afternoon, months after the verdict, Oliver wheeled me out to the garden behind our house. The winter air had softened the first lavender buds showing through the soil. He bent down to adjust my blanket, smiling in that quiet, boyish way that still made my heart ache with pride. I rested my hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Money is not the goal, my son. It's just a tool to protect our dignity." He looked up, eyes shining. "You taught me that, Mom." The wind rustled through the lavender, carrying the faint scent of spring. For the first time in years, everything felt right, not perfect, but honest. And that, I thought, was more than enough. The morning after everything settled, I found myself on the porch again, the same spot where I had once sat, wondering if anyone would ever believe my truth. The snow had melted into patches of damp earth, and the first sunlight of spring touched the lavender buds near the railing. I poured myself a cup of tea and watched the neighbors walking their dogs, children riding bikes, life returning to its quiet rhythm. When one of them stopped to ask how I was, I smiled and said softly, "You know, not every marriage is built on love, and not every dollar earns you respect." My voice didn't carry anger anymore, only clarity. Inside, Oliver was humming while wiping down the kitchen counter. The clatter of dishes mixed with the faint music from the radio. We had decided to clean the house together that morning, not because it needed to impress anyone, but because it felt right to start fresh. As he lifted a framed photo of his father to dust it, I noticed how calm his hands looked. No more shaking, no more guilt. I folded a linen cloth and placed it on the shelf, a small act that somehow felt like restoring order, not just to a room, but to a life. We didn't talk about the trial anymore. There was nothing left to dissect. Justice had already done what it was meant to do. What remained now was to live quietly, deliberately, with dignity. I had no interest in proving anything to the world. My victory was not in headlines or applause. It was in peace. The kind that doesn't need to be shown off. Later, as Oliver stepped out to check the garden, I sat back with my tea and let the warmth spread through my palms. The world still spun, indifferent to who had won or lost. But somewhere out there, I knew other women like me were still sitting in silence, afraid, disrespected, forgotten. I wanted them to know that silence can be broken, that dignity is not something others give you, but something you reclaim. So if you are listening to my story, remember this. Dignity cannot be priced by the money someone gives you or the home they let you stay in. It's the quiet strength that rises when you've been pushed too far. If you've ever been looked down upon in your own home, speak up. Share your story. Because where truth exists, justice will eventually find its way there too. And if this story reaches you wherever you are, let your voice be heard. Comment, like, or simply whisper your city's name. Every word you share keeps the light on for those still living in the dark.